Welcome to Aurora's monthly training on heat illness prevention. Today we are going to talk about how heat can affect you and what symptoms you should watch out for. A heat-related illness can often affect you before you even realize it, so it's important to be very aware of the signs. Statistics: heat-related deaths in the U.S. There are a significant number of heat-related deaths each year. However, experts say that these statistics are incomplete. Here's why. Pre-existing medical conditions can significantly increase an individual's vulnerability to heat. The stress of a hot day can increase the chance of dying from a heart attack, other heart conditions, or respiratory diseases such as pneumonia. These causes of death are much more common than heat-related illnesses such as heat stroke. Thus, this indicator very likely underestimates the number of deaths caused by exposure to heat. Just like we can't let a car engine overheat or it shuts down, we don't want your body to get too hot. Let's start by talking about heat. Where does the heat come from that causes our bodies to overheat? Environmental factors to consider include air temperature, measured with a normal thermometer. This is the temperature of the air around us. Although it is the easiest factor to measure, it is the least important under hot conditions. If air temperature is the only measurement taken, it is difficult to predict how workers will be affected by the heat. Humidity: this is the amount of water in the air. Under hot conditions, people feel even hotter when the air is more humid than when it is drier. Although a person will sweat, the sweat will not evaporate as quickly if the air is filled with moisture. Less evaporation means less cooling. Radiant and conductive heat: this is heat given off by anything that is hot, such as the sun, molten metal, hot pipes, or a heater. It eventually heats the air, but heats people more quickly. Radiant heat affects any person working in sunlight or near a work process that radiates heat. By simply moving from sun to shade, a person can feel the difference that radiant heat makes. Physical activity: body temperature increases with physical activity. Under warm or hot conditions, physical activity can increase the effect of heat on a person. Protective clothing: clothing can shield a worker from radiant heat, prevent sweat from evaporating, or help to transfer heat. Protective clothing that is not appropriate under hot conditions can be a problem. This includes clothing that does not allow air or moisture to pass through it, air or water vapor impermeable clothing, or multiple layers of clothing. Measuring heat exposures. Heat Index, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. There's more to measuring heat exposure than just taking the temperature. NOAA has developed a heat index system that calculates humidity levels and air temperatures to give people an idea of how hot it actually feels. They use the heat index to warn the public about hot weather emergencies. Measuring heat exposures. Heat Index, OSHA adaptation. OSHA has divided heat index values into 4 bands associated with 4 risk levels. These colored bands differ slightly from those appearing in the NOAA heat index chart, which was developed for the public. The NOAA bands have been modified for use at worksites. There are more complicated methods, too. Professional health and safety agencies have developed testing that can be done to set safe heat exposures depending on the type of work that is being done. Considerations are made for temperature, evaporative cooling, exposure to sun, the types of clothing and PPE worn by workers, worker acclimatization, the workload, and the ratio between the amount of time spent working and resting. Work classifications. Obviously, heavier workloads result in increased risk for heat disorders. Asked, why? Look for body temperature increases with physical activity. Under warm or hot conditions, physical activity can increase the effect of heat on a person. The more physical the activity, the more we need to pay attention to how our bodies are reacting to the heat, and to manage our heat exposure. This chart has some examples of different types of activities and their effect on heat exposure. Controlling heat exposure. Heat exposure can be controlled using engineering controls, personal protective equipment, PPE, work practices. So how can we control heat exposure? Through the application of one or more engineering controls, work practices, or personal protective equipment. Aurora implements multiple engineering controls: shade, ventilation, air cooling, air circulation, shielding from radiant heat sources, and insulating radiant heat sources. When we block direct sunlight, we can reduce temperatures by up to 15 degrees. Canopies, umbrellas, and other temporary structures or devices may be used to provide shade. One indicator that blockage is sufficient is when objects do not cast a shadow in the area of blocked sunlight. Ventilation involves bringing cooler, outside air into the hot work area, but this is not always possible. Air conditioning is usually only feasible for small areas, but a cool room can be used as a rest area near a hot working location. Fans cool people by helping remove body heat and increasing the rate at which sweat evaporates, but fans do not help as much when the air temperature is higher than the person's skin temperature. Heat coming from hot surfaces can be controlled either by insulating the heat source, steam pipes, or by setting up shields between the heat source and the team members. Sometimes heavy clothing is required to protect a person against contact with hot materials or surfaces. Impermeable chemical protective clothing is another example of clothing used for protection which can contribute to heat exposure. Another area of engineering control would be to use power assists and tools that reduce the physical demands placed on the team member. Less metabolic energy used for the job means less risk of overexposure to heat. Controlling heat exposure. Heat exposure can be controlled using engineering controls, personal protective equipment, PPE, work practices. There are specialized types of PPE that can be worn under other types of protective clothing to cool the body. Ice vests have many pockets where ice packets can be inserted. Water-cooled garments have a battery-driven pump that circulates coolant through chambers in the clothing. Another system uses an air supply to circulate air around workers in impermeable suits. A more common technique that might be considered as PPE is to wear wet clothing, headbands, or bandanas. This could also be considered a type of work practice control. Controlling heat exposure. The primary way to ensure you, or your team members, manage your exposure to the heat is within your control. The following work practices can be very effective, using intermittent rest periods of no less than 5 minutes to recover from the heat. Resting within cool recovery zones or shaded rest areas. Drinking small quantities of water frequently, up to 4 cups per hour. Using the buddy system, work in pairs, when working in hot conditions. Monitor other team members for symptoms. Pacing the work, or reducing the physical demands of the work. Scheduling work for cooler times of the day or when heat-producing equipment isn't being operated. Wearing light, loose-fitting, breathable, like cotton, clothing. Taking care of ourselves. Not everyone is affected equally by the heat. Age, body mass, degree of physical fitness, metabolism, medications, use of alcohol or drugs, water consumption, caffeine consumption, and a variety of medical conditions, such as hypertension, all affect a person's sensitivity to heat. Another factor is whether or not a person is accustomed to the heat. By gradually being exposed to work in hot conditions, a body develops a greater tolerance for the heat. For most people, acclimatization peaks within 4 to 14 days when performing regular work for at least 2 hours per day in the heat. However, it is difficult to predict who will be affected by the heat or when someone will be affected. Heat exhaustion. How to respond when a team member suffers from heat exhaustion. Rest in cool, shaded area for 5 minutes. Take heat relief breaks. Gradually adjust to working in heat. So we need to always be on watch for ourselves and for our team members. If you or your team member are experiencing one or more of these symptoms, a headache, dizziness, or fainting. Feel fatigued, weak or have wet skin. Become irritable or confused. Thirsty, nauseous, or vomiting. These are the early signs that you need to cool off, rest, and drink water to let your body recover. If you don't, you could develop some of the more serious effects of heat. People react to the heat differently, so you or your team member may have just a few of these symptoms, or most of them. Heat stroke. How to respond when a team member suffers from heat stroke. Get immediate medical attention. Remove to cool, shaded area. Soak clothing with cool water, fan body vigorously. Never leave unattended. If you or your team member start to feel confused, or if you vomit or become faint, you may be having a more serious response, heat stroke. Skin is hot and dry. Sweating is the main way our bodies cool off, so not sweating is a very serious emergency. Skin appears red in color. Body temperature is 103 or higher. Mentally confused or delirious. May have convulsions or become unconscious. May be confused, unable to think clearly, pass out, collapse, or have seizures, fits. If this happens, get immediate medical attention. Again, move to a cool, shaded area, and take more aggressive steps to cool down the body. Soak clothing with cool water. Fan body vigorously. Never leave the team member unattended. What to do when a team member becomes dizzy, lightheaded, or nauseous. Provide a bit more aid for a team member suffering from a heat-related illness if they are dizzy, lightheaded, or nauseous. If they're dizzy or lightheaded, lay the team member on their back in the cool environment, and raise their feet a few inches. Continue providing the team member with small quantities of water, up to 4 cups per hour. If they're nauseous, lay the team member on their right side. Again, continue to provide water. A case study. Putting it all together. Case study. Jeffrey is a new team member. On his second day, he works hard for long periods without a break. In the early afternoon, his team member, Peggy, looks over and sees that Jeffrey is sweating profusely and is acting strangely. Peggy asks Jeffrey what's going on. Jeffrey says he has a slight headache and feels dizzy. What should Peggy do? Answer. Move Jeffrey to a cooler place to rest in the shade. Give Jeffrey water. Notify the supervisor. Peggy has Jeffrey sit down and gets him some water. Jeffrey tells Peggy that he says he wanted to show he could work hard, and didn't drink much water because he didn't feel thirsty. What went wrong? Answer. Jeffrey wasn't used to working in the heat. He should have had less intense work until he got used to working in the heat, acclimatization. Nobody had not made sure Jeffrey got adequate breaks. Jeffrey hadn't consumed enough water. Don't wait until you are thirsty to drink. Jeffrey wanted to prove he could work hard. He didn't report symptoms as soon as he felt them. Thank you for participating in this monthly training. If you have any questions, please get with your safety department or reach out to your regional safety manager. They will be glad to answer any questions you might have. Have a safe day.